Hello and welcome to Meeting People with me, Amal Pandya. Meeting People is a podcast where I have long conversations with rebellious, adventurous and sometimes courteous free spirits. Thank you, Fred, for sparing the time. It's a conversation I've been really looking forward to for a while, so I'm really grateful you've opened up a lovely morning like today in this lovely garden of yours, so thank you. I thought to just allow the audience to understand who you are, you could take us back to the early 90s and tell us about some of your work you did with the Russian government post the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you were out in Russia, you were consulting with the Prime Minister at the time, who was Russia's longest serving consecutive Prime Minister, for a gentleman called Viktor Chernomyrdin. Could you just tell us a bit about that time and what it was that you were doing then?
Russia had collapsed, or at least the Soviet Union had, and this was a historic opportunity, a world-changing, potentially, opportunity to abandon the traditional capitalist model and to refine the way government raised its revenue to create a free market in which people were genuinely free. Because coming out of the Soviet Union, all the natural resources were in public ownership, and I reasoned that if they retained those natural resources in public ownership, collected the rents, then they wouldn't have to introduce the Western-style tax regime on people's earned incomes. Here was a golden opportunity to create heaven on earth, as close as we can get to heaven on earth.
Yes.
So, yes, I spent 10 years traveling backwards and forwards, consulting, organizing conferences in the parliament, the Duma. We worked with their topmost academician economists in the Russian Academy of Sciences who subscribed to the idea that there would be a way for Russia to organize the distribution of income so that what people earned, they kept.
Yeah.
And the rents of locations and natural resources, which we all helped to create, could be pooled into the public purse to fund the new infrastructure that would have to be built for a free society. The golden opportunity, once in history, never mind lifetime, but in history. And so, yes, my colleagues came from all over the world, and we held consultations and conferences, and we did everything humanly possible to explain to the few people who were at the center of power that this was a historic opportunity. There was one problem. The IMF and Washington, D.C., Brussels and London had a different idea.
Right.
They wanted to reproduce in Russia the model that we have in the West. They succeeded and we failed. They insisted on shock therapy, meaning privatize everything, including the natural resources which were in public ownership. Not just create new privately owned industries, which is what should happen, but privatize everything.
Yeah.
The Russian people at the center of power fell for it. Yeltsin, as the prime minister, bought into it. Every society has those few greedy people who want to make their mint. They accumulate their wealth rapidly at everybody else's expense. They moved into the Kremlin. They privatized all the public assets. They weren't interested in creating value for the people of Russia. They wanted to grab the wealth, take it out of Russia, invest it in the West, build their mega yachts in the south of France. The result was the appointment of Putin, the KGB boss, to oversee that rotten system.
And the rest is history.
And the people of Ukraine are paying the price today.
Yeah. So let's within that framing or context, let's wind forward to today. We are, expecting a Labour budget from a new government. And let me paint this scenario to you. Rachel Reeves stands up at the dispatch box in Parliament and announces that all taxes are going to be replaced by a single tax on land, much to the consternation and irritation of landowners. What would the next 3, 5, 10 years look like were that to be a reality, were she to have the boldness to stand up and do that? What would the future look like in that situation?
Well, we can actually go back into British history just 100 years ago and see exactly what happened.
Right.
Because that's what happened in 1910 or 1909. And then in the budget of 1910, the Liberal government did indeed begin the process of shifting the taxes off wages and onto location rents. At the same time, they introduced what we now call the welfare state. They said, look, people unemployed need support. We need to give them money if they haven't got jobs. Old people need pensions. Where was the money to come from? We're going to raise it from the rents of location, and that money will fund the beginnings of a genuine welfare state. So for 10 years, Parliament adopted that policy after a constitutional crisis because the landlords didn't like it. After a constitutional crisis, it was introduced, passed, and the process was begun. It took 10 years. But what happened in 1920? The government was persuaded to give the rental revenue back, which it had collected over the previous 5-ish years, back to the landowners.
Right.
And the whole thing was scrapped. The welfare state concept remained in place, but the revenue was now going to come from people's taxed earned incomes.
Yes.
So we know how to phase in this transition. It couldn't be done overnight. It had to be done over a 10-year period to avoid the shocks to the banking system and so on. So if Rachel Reeves did stand up in Parliament and did say that this would be introduced but phased in over 10 years, we would be able to raise the revenue, begin to adjust the sources of the revenue, begin to reduce taxes, the tax burden on people's earned incomes, which includes the profits from genuine investments in wealth production, and to raise the revenue instead from location values and the rents of the winds and all of the rents of natural resources that are generated within our natural habitats. It's a lot of rents, which at the moment are going into private pockets for people who don't actually earn it.
Yeah. Just by function of owning it,
just because they own the property rights, they can collect something that they don't work for and they didn't earn. Well, the implications of Rachel Reeves doing that would be fantastic, because it would alter the future horizon. Instead of what's now going to happening, the future would be modified in a way that would enable the people of Britain to handle the chaos that is coming down the road. But Rachel Reeves isn't going to do that.
No.
And so I'm afraid at the moment, it's a pipe dream.
Yeah. So that's the solution. Let's sort of step back and talk about the problem for a bit. And I think I've certainly been on a journey of identifying the problem, and it's taken me, almost this sort of climbing of a ladder to get there. And on each rung, I identify a symptom. This is a symptom, and and I misidentify that symptom as the true cause. So one rung could be fiscal ill discipline, We're spending too much, which is creating inflation. Or monetary or discipline could be another one. Or overregulation and too much intrusion by bureaucrats. But the bad education could be another example. But the closer the more you keep climbing, you get to this, and the more you keep existing in this paradigm that we're in, where things are just getting more and more expensive, and everything you spend your money on, when you really look into it, basically goes into paying rent, whether it's commuting, whether it's buying something from a cafe. Why is it so expensive? Because that cafe owner has to pay rent to the landlord, and to earn a living, he's got to charge higher prices. Everyone in my generation is really struggling to own property, and what I chanced upon Henry George, and hence this conversation is happening now, because I found your work through that. Who was Henry George? Can you, for people who are economically interested, give a little explanation of how he breaks down the difference between land, labour and capital, and how it's been misinterpreted by neoliberals or neoclassical economists versus the Adam Smiths of this world, and just give an overview of why the kind of Georgist School of economics has really identified the problem of where we are now today.
Henry George was a journalist in San Francisco. He was quite content reporting on the affairs of a emerging society. Land was in abundance, and he would take a ride out. This was in the 1870s. He would take a ride out into the vast territory that was California on a buggy pulled by horses. And one day he thought, with all this land, how come there are so many people locked in poverty in America? It didn't make sense. If people wanted work, what was stopping them? So he started digging, and he came to the realization that the problem ultimately was with the way governments raised their revenue to favor those who collected the rents, the location rents, or the natural resource rents of the nation. The revenue that they didn't create, everybody helps to create that stream of value we call economic rent. Therefore, we all have a share in that. But no, historically, we'd already alienated that rent to a small class of people. And Henry George realized that we're never going to eliminate poverty until we redesign property rights so that people kept what they produced, but paid for what they received. That would mean the governments would have to raise the revenue from the rents of land. So Henry George wrote this book, Progress and Poverty, which created the first global reform movement. He sailed on sailing boats to Australia and New Zealand. He came to Ireland, where he was locked up as a troublemaker. He came and spoke at the Oxford Union, where the aristocracy made sure that they reinforced the opposition against him, because this was striking at the ultimate power within the system. Who controls rent controls everything in society. As you say, whichever way you turn, whatever problem you face, it all comes back to how are we dividing up the income? Is it fair? And goodness gracious me, no, it's not fair. People who own, and that includes me, property, who own locations, are gathering up, by doing nothing, the flow of community-created value, which means governments then have to raise their income by taxing people's wages, which creates all manner of distortions. So it's chaos on chaos. And Well, Henry George originated this global movement. It was truly global. It still exists. It's still advocating the need for reason and justice. But the system is so intent on accumulating something for nothing that people are reluctant to get involved in campaigning for the only policy that will actually solve our problems.
So can we dig into that a bit? I'm intuitively a free market guy, kind of like a laissez-faire approach to things. And so when I was first looking into this, it felt almost weird to think about property, property ownership not being banned, but basically you not being able to keep the kind of value. You buy something and then you profit from it by selling it later on. What's wrong with that? That's surely a part of being in a free society. What is it exactly about the fact that the ownership of land isn't part of the kind of free market system? You're not penalising a free economy.
Well, to start with, we do not have a free market economy, and for so long as the location rents are privatised, we will never have a free market. Look, it all tracks back to the principles of freedom. You're entitled to keep what you create.
Yeah.
That's freedom. Hang on, but a big slice of what we create is taken away from us for no good reason, that some people own the property rights to what economists call economic rent. The rent of locations, the rent of the sun, the rent of the winds, the rent of fossil fuels. Nobody creates the sun, the wind, the minerals beneath the ground, but we all collectively, through our demands, through the consumer markets, we create collectively a value for those natural resources. And therefore we are entitled to, in a free society, share in the value that we all help to create. And if we shared that value by funding the public services that we can't individually create for ourselves, like complex infrastructure, like the education that we want to be in the public sector, or public hospitals, if we want those amenities, and if we paid for them out of the value we all help to create, then we have a free society. But because we don't do that, because we privatize a value that belongs to everybody,
right,
we lose the very principle of freedom. And so chaos therefore reigns. And what we have today is not a free market. Once you start taxing people's wages, you get unemployment, poverty, people having to go to food banks. This is not a free society. Something's missing. Well, the free market doctrine doesn't tell us what is missing, because the free market doctrine was actually tailored to accommodate the people who held the power, who were the nobility back in the 17th, 16th and 18th centuries, who wanted to keep pocketing the rent that everybody else was creating.
Is this why they found the doctrine of Malthus quite appealing? Because it didn't seem to affect them, that we're overpopulating, and so what we need to do is kind of cull the population to kind of deal with poverty. That was something the elites quite intuitively liked in some ways, because it was a solution that didn't affect them in the way socializing rents would.
Thomas Malthus did in fact teach the economics of rent, but yes, he came up with a theory that, if people are poor, it's because they're having too many kids. Yeah. So we can blame them, which shifts responsibility off the people who are the actual cause. of poverty. They didn't directly cause it, but they were responsible for it because they were capturing the community-created value and therefore having to force their governments to tax people's earned incomes, which as a consequence altered the pricing system itself. Now the pricing system has to accommodate the fact that a whole chunk of what is earned has to be paid as wages. Well, that distorts the free market and creates the chaos which we can see all around us. People sleeping in the streets. Is this freedom? People having to go to food banks in order to put food on the table for their children. Is that a free market? Well, yeah, it is the free market we have today, but it's not freedom.
And it's a function of, Henry George called his book Progress and Poverty, and it's a function of the more advanced we get, the more innovative we get, the more developments we have, the more prosperous we are. There is a type of poverty that sustains and is sticky and grows from that by virtue of the fact that landowners collect a greater and greater chunk of that innovation and prosperity. It goes to them first before it gets distributed to the rest of us. And do you therefore think it's no accident that areas in the West where crime and homelessness are at their most prevalent are almost the most, California is an example, the most innovative parts of the world and the most prosperous? There's the most wealth there, yet there is the most poverty. That's Henry George almost predicted that, didn't he?
Exactly. The mechanism of collecting the rent for private use corrupts the market system so that the more prosperous it becomes from advances in technology or investment in public infrastructure, the top slice is taken away before the rest of the society enjoys the benefits. That top slice is the rent, and that's how the system works. But in economic theory, in the universities and so on, they don't teach this. Economics has been designed to conceal the impact of progress through technological and scientific advances, because to teach the reality would offend the sensibilities of those who were collecting the revenue. Today, homeowners really believe that they earn the increased value of their homes. But no, they don't. It just comes to them by virtue of the fact that they own the deeds to the location. The value of the house itself is going down through depreciation all the time. That one's home is depreciating.
Yeah.
But the value is of the location that's going up. But we've been brainwashed into believing that we really earned that capital gain on our homes. It's brainwashing in order to sustain a system of injustice.
Who designed the economic curriculum, let's say, or the economic kind of doctrine of today? Where did that come from?
Well, it grew over the centuries. The starting point would have been like the 16th century. Institutions were created to reinforce the privatization of location rents. The Bank of England came into existence to provide the mortgages for the people who were now, having enclosed the common lands of England, wanted to sell the land. So they needed the liquidity. So we start building the institutions. The legal system comes in to help the mortgage system, which had to be created. Over those centuries, the mindset starts to shift. The language is altered. The big push to redefine economic theory came in the late 19th century.
Okay.
Most of it was in America, where what are known as the robber barons started funding the universities. The robber barons made their money out of, they built a railway track, oh, let's create a settlement in the Wild West. Whoa, land values are going up. Yes, but the robber barons are now collecting that rent. Yeah. They didn't create the communities. The people created the communities. They should have kept the rents, but no, it all was channeled to the robber barons, who then made sure they hung on to that value by appointing university chairs. So now the people who became professors, they began to amend the doctrines. And so from then on, and it's been, the detail of that has been documented by the late Mason Gaffney, who was a professor of economics in California, and he traced these episodes of robber barons creating a chair, a professorship in a university, many of them in Chicago,
yes.
but in the Ivy League universities, who then became the lackeys for the big landowners in America. And so this is how neoclassical, which is actually post-classical economics, none of the rubbish that we read in economic theory today was part of the classical economics. So the economics today ought not to be called neoclassical. There's nothing neo about it. It is post-classical economics, which is essentially brainwashing generations of students.
So post-classical economics, from my understanding, has shifted land to be a subsection of capital.
Correct.
Effectively. And I know this from being an economics A-level student and also working in the investment industry. I'm kind of coached and trained to think in terms of a balance sheet, and land is just a little, cost subsection of the investment we have to make in factories, equipment, staff. But in reality, land is the top line item that you've got to pay off before you can even think about being innovative. And there's a great there's a film by the actor Timothy Spall. I've forgotten the name of the film, but the plot, very briefly, is he's a gangster, and it's sort of 2009, 2010 time, and he, through his sort of shenanigans with the council, gets whiff of the fact that London's going to win the Olympics, and the Olympics is going to happen in East London. So he basically uses his intimidation and thuggery tactics to acquire property from all the individual owners of property in the East London area, and then it winds forward 15 years to today, and he's a multi-millionaire just by virtue of the fact that he knew where the Olympics were going to be, and he's just captured the rent difference, and he's the villain that has to get taken down. And this is a kind of, I guess, a classic example of someone doing none of the work but being in the right place at the right time, basically buying land for speculative purposes, piggybacking. So if someone starts a university and then there's a cafe that's next to the university and then a library, just by function of owning property in the area, you're benefiting of that.
Well, that's how it operates.
Yeah.
So it's a system of annexation. We're going to build a railway. Oh, that's good. Well, before the prices around the railway stations start to go up, I'll go and buy the land on the cheap. When they lay the railway track, that investment will push up the location's attractions. People are willing to go and live close to the railway. They're willing to pay for the benefit of using the railway, but they're not paying the railway investors. They're paying the landowners who just bought up the land all around the stations.
Yeah.
So it is a robbery in the system. But it's not presented as such. As you say, land is now a byproduct of capital. Capital.
You're a real estate entrepreneur, are you? Kind of, yeah.
Capital is something we create. We're entitled to the returns on our capital. We saved money to create technologies that produces products that people want to buy, and they're willing to pay for those products. So I'm entitled to my returns on my capital. But hang on, we've buried land in that concept of capital. So now it's a safe process of nobody's going to ask awkward questions about, hang on, most of your returns are from the land that you own. Nothing to do with what you added to the value of the community.
And too much capital is tied up in investing in real estate versus in technology or innovation, whatever it might be. So just winding back, so we have this lovely, very powerful flame of progressivism in the late 19th century, earliest 20th century, through the Henry George figuring this out. And then you get socialism that comes along, and that's more of a scorched earth approach, let's say, to improving the lot of many. Did socialism and then the kind of horrors of communism thereafter kind of set back that cause in the minds of people? When they hear someone talking about Georgism, do they think socialism and they think of the horrors of that, and therefore aren't as discerning as they should be?
Well, so we can see what was happening. If we go back to the 19th century, the nobility in Britain were, excuse me for using this term, shit scared of Henry George. They didn't care about Karl Marx because Karl Marx was no threat to them. For Karl Marx, he described rent as shitty business. That's why I use that word. In his written work, Karl Marx dismisses rent, even though he put it at number one in his 10 demands in the manifesto, which he wrote almost at the outset of his career. But no, rent became that shitty business.
Right.
It's insignificant. Capital and the wicked employers were the enemy of the working class. So you see, socialism came along and it didn't worry the people who had the real power, the nobility and the gentry in Britain, because socialism and Marxism was no threat to their vital interest. Henry George cut through all the nonsense and got to the root of the problem. He was the real threat, and that's why they focused on Henry George when he came and went on a speaking tour throughout Britain. The nobility were there to jeer and try and do him down because he really posed a threat to their privileges.
So of the three factors of production, land, labour and capital, the land successfully got labour and capital to fight each other and create this false dichotomy. And that's been going through. Even today you hear about people like Piketty, the owners of capital are excessively profiting at the expense of earners of wage or providers of labour. And that's the battle that we need to fight. But actually, labour and capital are best friends. They need each other. One. They're both hand in glove. And actually, they both need to, as you said, keep the benefits of their labour or their risk taking. And it's what needs to be socialised. It's just being in the right place at the right time, owning the right thing. One thing I hear as a pushback is, well, let's take them in turn. Firstly, we have all these needs, welfare, infrastructure. Would there be enough money to pay for all of this if we stop taxing capital and earned income and just taxed location rents?
If we did switch the revenue system, the rents would be coming out of our ears. There'd be so much of it, and we'd be using it for our benefit, so we'd be happy with that. Now, this raises a really important point, which, of course, is never discussed in economic theory. Rent is buried not just in what is privatized by those who own location rents or who own the right to collect the winds. The winds that we now need for clean energy are generating a rent. The rents of those winds are being collected by the people on whose land you have to put the windmills.
Right.
So they are collecting the wind rents. Or if you own a hotel on a sunny coastal region, you're collecting the rents of the sun by virtue of the fact you own those locations. That's just one category. The other category of rent takers is the government. But hang on, we've said that governments tax people's wages and the profits of capital. Yes, but here's a really important insight that nobody discusses. Actually, the revenue that governments collect is from rent, yes, but it comes indirectly from people who earn wages. So along comes the government and says, oh, you're a wage earner, we're going to tax your wages. So the wage earner then says, well, but in that case, if I'm going to exist, I'm going to have to reduce the amount of rent I can pay for the house that I'm renting or that I'm wanting to buy. So ultimately, the revenue that governments are collecting are out of rent. So if you add the bulk of the revenue that governments collect today, together with the rent that's available, that's not taxed, that's rotating in the private markets, put the two together, and what you've got is about half of national income is actually rent. Yeah. So the concept is at core, all taxes come out of rent. Again, the literature is clear enough if you know where to look for it. It's spelt out again by the gentleman I referred to earlier, the late Mason Gaffney, professor of economics in California. All taxes come out of rent, but nobody discusses that. It's the way this indirect collection of revenue, because where else could they collect it from? Where else can governments go to collect revenue other than the net income? They can't collect it out of people's real wages because then they're earning less than what they're earning and they have to go to food banks. Well, yeah, that's what now actually happens because the burden of the collection is such that not only is government collecting the net income indirectly via their taxes on consumption and 101 ways of collecting revenue indirectly from rent. The burden of that is such that people who are earning incomes still can't put food on the table for their kids, so they go to food banks. So the system has really broken down. But in answer to your question, would there be enough revenue? There's so much of it that not only could we pay for all the public services, we'd be able to give a universal benefit to everybody, a small sum just to get rid of the rents that were being collected. It's one of those hoax objections that arise because our minds have been so distorted by post-classical economics that we can't think straight about the facts.
So just to make sure I understand that, can I try and give a different example to illustrate that, and you can kind of correct me,
yes,
if possible. So an example is a nurse, let's say, will earn more in London than he or she would in another part of the country.
Yep.
That delta that difference between those two wages is basically money coming out of the pockets of taxpayers going into the pocket of the nurse living in London and then coming out of his or her pocket and going into the landlord's pocket effectively, because you're paying more so that they can live and pay rent or buy a property that is more expensive, capitalizing rent for a landowner today. And that has to be collected by taxation, and that tax is therefore coming out of rent to go back into rent. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's it. But look, this is an important example. People working in London earn quite appreciably more than people who working in the northeast. Except that by the time you deduct their taxes and the amount they are paying as rent or mortgages, their real living standard, real wages, take-home wages, come down to the level of what's being collected up in the northeast of England.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's this rotten system through competition, it levels wages, it levels the returns to capital, and the difference, the Ricardian rent difference, wherever it's collected, ends up in either going into government as revenue or the private pockets of those who own the assets that collect rents.
And this is the margin of production.
Yes.
Yeah, and basically, not only is it from rent, but it's also the fact that your food shop will be more expensive in London because the person who owns the shop has to charge more to pay their rent.
Yeah.
And so it's in everything that you spend.
Correct. So we've got a nightmare economic system in practice and in theory, and the system won't allow us to clean up the language we use. So we talk about wealth. Oh, the Labour government wants to tax our wealth. Well, yeah, but unfortunately, by taxing wealth, you're not only taxing some of the rents, you're also taxing what people are earning.
Yeah.
There's no forensic difference between the two. So you end up screwing up the system even further. And that's what Labour is going to do now. It thinks it's going to help the working class, but in the process, it's actually amplifying the problems in the system because it doesn't know what it's doing.
And just to make sure we've got it covered, another example would be Silicon Valley, San Francisco, California is a phenomenally expensive place to live. Like to buy a property, or you have to be a millionaire in some shape or form. And that is purely a function of innovation done by entrepreneurs, creative people in decades gone by, leading to success, leading to job creation, leading to warehouses, distribution factories, and that therefore being used as a source of land speculation by people who either were lucky enough to live there whilst that innovation was happening and that risk-taking was happening, or people who have come in and bought land, around the vicinity of Silicon Valley because they're predicting that all this innovation will push out the need for universities and warehouses and accommodation. So they're speculating on that, which is therefore pushing up prices in the parts of the San Francisco that are further away from the hub. Is that right?
Yep, exactly right. And Silicon Valley is made up of, yes, innovators who are entitled to be well rewarded for what they're doing, but in the process they're being enriched by collecting the rents of the electromagnetic spectrum. Right. Most of the new technologies that we now use in our laptops and our cameras and so on, we're communicating with everybody in the rest of the world through this unseen asset called the spectrum. Whoa, that's got to be really valuable. Who's pocketing it? People like Musk and those who own the so-called platforms.
Right.
Think about Amazon. Amazon is the owner of it is one of the 2 or 3 richest men in the world. Most of the revenue he's collecting is not through the sale of products through his website. It's through collecting the rents that enable him to access anybody in the world just by tapping a few words on a PC. And then he sends the lorry to deliver the product to your home. And you think, this is a wonderful business operation. Yeah, but most of that revenue that he's collecting doesn't belong to him. He didn't create the spectrum. He's exploiting it, and he's been allowed to harness those rents and keep them. So his fabulous wealth, most of it is unearned. It belongs to all of us.
Yeah, and someone observed to me recently, my first guest, a gentleman called Simon Evan Cook, said, I was talking to him about Georgism, and he's just to layer on that, he said a lot of the innovation, most successful companies we've had of late, like Amazon or Airbnb or the social media platforms are a response to the fact that land prices is just so expensive. So how do you relocalize society, because it's so expensive to live near a shopping center or a place where you can buy things easily? It will get that to you in response. So it's actually a perverse sort of incentive that's created this innovation to enable us to sort of rent out our properties a bit more easily or access things more easily without living so close to the epicenter of production. So just moving on to the second objection I hear a lot is how would we in Fred Harrison's paradigm be able to value land or value it? Because if there's no private ownership of locations, how does one know whether they're paying a fair price for it or not, so that they could buy it to use it for the purposes that they want to use it for?
Well, there's something called the free market that would help us. In that free market, people would compete. I want that land. Oh, you want it? Are you going to pay more than me? Because if not, I've got it. Look, if you log on to the New South Wales Valuer General's website, that describes how in Australia they raise revenue directly from the rent of land,
right? How
they value the land, how you can appeal against the valuations, what people pay. And in terms of the mechanics of it, there's no problem. They're doing it in Denmark. There is a direct charge on the rents of locations. The formula for determining the market values are all set out on the websites of the government. If you don't like your valuation, you can appeal against it. There is no practical problem.
Yeah.
The problem is only raised by those who don't really want to be serious about discussing the change in the revenue system.
So are house builders land banking in order to profit from rises in property? Or are they just being risk averse because of the planning system?
The big chunk of what they make is from the location values.
Right.
And they are land banking. They say, oh, the planning system is obstructing us from building the houses. Yeah, it's true that we have planning permission for building houses for the next 20 years, but it's the planning system that's the problem. Hang on, how can it be that you've got so many planning permissions in your back pocket and you're not using them and you're blaming the planning system? It's just a way of distracting people from the reality. That's all.
Yeah, because I hear this a lot from my free market friends. You know, the real... it's a supply-demand imbalance. We're not having enough supply because there's too much government intervention in the market, which is forcing house builders not to build because of the restrictive planning system. But you're arguing that this is nonsense, basically. There's not enough house building because there's an incentive to restrict supply, because you pocket the benefit of prices going up by restricting supply. Is that right?
That's a sort of convoluted arguments that people use to avoid acknowledging the reality. If there was a full rental charge on locations...
Don't worry, it's fine. The microphones will cut out.
If there was a full location charge on land, builders would have no reason to hang on to the land in their banks. They would get on and increase the supply, and there would be no housing problem. But we blame the planning system, so therefore we don't actually address the reality.
And should we blame the NIMBYs? Well, or are they part of the problem?
Well, we're victims. Yes, NIMBYs don't want construction to obscure their view of the green fields. They claim it's because they want to view the green fields and save the green landscape. But they know that if that land is built on, they're going to lose some of the capital value. But we are weaned into this rotten system. We're playing the system because what else can we do? So, yes, then the NIMBYs become one of the barriers to change, which the people who own the real value, the bulk, the vast estates in central London, who happen to be aristocrats, they're happy that the NIMBYs should be obstructing the planning system because that distracts from the realities.
So is it frustrating for you, therefore, to whenever you read the newspapers or, commentary, that 95% of what you're reading is looking at palliative measures to address symptoms of the problem, and there is very little mental energy being expended on finding the root problem, and so it's almost worthless reading or getting hot and bothered about some little reform that tackles one little corner of things when the real problem is so grand.
The answer is yes, it's frustrating, but I'm now well used to that absurd situation where you have to reinterpret what you've read in order to understand what's really going on. Yeah. It's now second nature. So I know that the journalists who are spouting rubbish, who are reporting nonsense, are doing so because that's their job. They're not revealing the reality, but I understand the nature of the problem that they face. They've got to work with what is available to them. The system says that we are going to exploit people by collecting the rents that everybody actually equally helped to create. And so
That's one of the appeals of Georgism to me, is that it's a way to get, Liz Truss's advisors in the room with Owen Jones, because it's equally progressive as it is business friendly or free market friendly, as because it addresses kind of this kleptocracy or crony capitalism that we live in, that both sides should be fighting. But the part of the frustration is, we had a one-off improvement in the supply side of the economy in the 80s with Reaganism and Thatcherism kind of deregulating, and then we had another one-off improvement through globalization in the 90s by just basically transferring all our manufacturing offshore to cheaper places. But we're kind of trying to now reheat both those souffles rather than find the next thing. So we saw that with Liz Truss. We just need to do Thatcherism again, and then we'll be fine. Or maybe what we're going to see with the new Keir Starmer government is we need to do go back to just globalization, unfettered globalization, and then we'll be fine. But it feels like we need that third new kind of genuine reform, and maybe kind of Georgism has had is ripe for its moment. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Does it frustrate you to kind of hear about kind of we just need to cut taxes and everything will be fine from the Conservative Party type of dialogue?
When the Conservatives say cut taxes, they don't say, therefore we're going to cut the teachers that are going to teach your children. They don't say, oh, we're going to cut taxes, therefore there'll be fewer nurses, so you won't be seen in hospitals quite as quickly with your life-threatening disease. Oh no, they keep separate the cutting the taxes with how we're going to fund the public services, so that there's no audit of the full picture. And then we get the supply side revolution that Thatcher gave us. That was no supply side revolution. What did she do? What was the crux of what she did? She said, oh, let's almost give away council houses. Let's create a lot more property owners who, having bought their council houses at cut prices, then sold their houses to collect the extra capital gain. That was the principal achievement of Margaret Thatcher. She added to the weight, the dead weight, that holds down the free market economy. It's the opposite of how she's presented.
Yeah. So it was a kind of one-off benefit to a subsection of the economy, of the electorate.
Just to reinforce the existing system.
So you talk about an interesting sliding doors moment happening in China, which I'd love you to expand on, if possible, between a gentleman called Dr. Sun Yat-sen and obviously we've all heard of Chairman Mao, but China had a choice between going down Maoism or following Dr. Sun. Who was he? What nearly happened in China, which could have been very interesting instead of what we saw with Maoism and the horrors that followed?
What happened in China from 1911 onwards is really interesting historically, because it shows how obliquely the perverted philosophy in the West managed to contaminate what was happening in China. Sun Yat-sen was a doctor. He learnt his medicine in Hawaii, and he traveled to America and to Britain, where he learnt about the economics of Henry George and John Stuart Mill. And he saw it made sense, collect the revenue of nature's resources to fund the public services. So he led the opposition to the last of what became the last dynasty in China, and he became the first president of a Republic of China. China could have been Taiwan from day one in 1911.
Right.
If China had become Taiwan in 1911, it would have transformed the lives of millions of people, instead of them being buried, killed by Chairman Mao and his Cultural Revolution. What happened was that Mao had picked up Marx from the West, whereas Sun Yat-sen had picked up Henry George and John Stuart Mill. The two ideologies clashed. The Sun Yat-sen stream fought on, tried to embed in China the doctrines of Dr. Sun Yat-sen. And as I say, if they had succeeded in doing that, they wouldn't have had to have waited till Formosa became Taiwan in the 1940s before Dr. Sun's agenda could be put in place. The reason why Taiwan is now fabulously rich, is up at the top of the scales of global income, is at the cutting edge of the new technology, is because when Chairman Mao drove the rump of Sun Yat-sen's people and army off the mainland onto this island called Formosa, what they did was introduce the land reforms and the tax reforms that enabled the people of Formosa, which became Taiwan, to flourish, which they did. So that's the twist. It wasn't the landlords from the West who directly obstructed Dr. Sun Yat-sen. It was this perverse idea which had emerged in the British Museum Library in London through a man called Karl Marx that polluted the mind of Chairman Mao, who therefore obstructed the Henry George idea in China. It's one of those historical tragedies, and what we're seeing now is the continuation. It's not that China thinks, oh, we own this territory called Formosa and therefore we want the land back. It's the continuation of this ideological conflict.
Right.
Beijing cannot allow the prosperity that flourishes on Taiwan to threaten their ideology of central control of the economy. So that's why President Xi says we will take back Taiwan by 2029, I think he's set the date. It's the unfinished ideological business, nothing to do with Formosa used to belong to China, which it never did, and therefore we want it back. No, it's the conflict that began with Dr. Sun Yat-sen.
It's about economics and vested interests.
And what was the best model for the people of China, yeah.
So in that example, you have a wonderful demonstration of two choices and also the outcomes of those two choices. On one side, you've got prosperity and innovation. And on the other, you've got, a century of misery and now some sort of wealth creation, alleviating poverty, but through a very tortured and unsustainable, fragile way. How do we, sitting here today, get the next Rachel Reeves to announce that budget that the Liberals did in 1912? What is it? A question of resources? Do Georgists just need more money to be able to spend money on marketing and public awareness, or is it? Does shit have to hit the fan before we realise the solution? Before we're desperate enough for the solution?
I fear it is the latter. It's not the resources. Over the last 100 years, the Georgist movement, because of the generous benefactors who contributed to the movement early in the 20th century, they had plenty of money. They could advertise, they could hold conferences, they did all of that. The system just did not want to know. Right. And I fear that, yes, we have to become desperate enough for the new generation. It's going to be the new generation that says there's something fundamentally wrong with this. Are we missing something? What are we missing? So it's got to begin with a conversation, not a revolution. Instead of blocking the motorways to say the government has got to do something about the environmental crisis, the government doesn't know what to do about the environmental crisis. There's no point in asking government to take action.
Yeah.
The young generation should be sitting down and saying, are we missing something? Can we go over everything and figure out what's missing? What do we really need to do? And hold that conversation. That's what it's going to take. You're contributing to that by this interview. Thank you very much for doing that.
Well, thank you. Well, it's a beginning journey, but you talk about, you're absolutely right. That concept of the shit life syndrome that you've mentioned in your notebooks, it just feels like things are, something has to give because it's just prohibitively expensive to exist as someone who is on a low median salary or just even a median salary. And you think, I'll give you an example. We've got young children who go to nursery. The cost of nursery is so high relative to most people's earnings. And my thought was I was okay with it because I thought, well, this is because being a nursery worker is so important. It's such an important job. The wages have to be significant to justify the fact that you're giving this person your child. You want them to be good. You want them to be paid well. And my wife was like, they're not paid well at all. I'm like, what? They get paid nothing. That cost is just going to rent. And I was just gobsmacked that, even the people that I think do a fantastic job don't get any recognition from that, from a remunerative perspective. And we're relying on their we're almost, with nurses and doctors and people like that, relying on their sense. We're abusing their sense of communal spirit, and we're making them take too much more than they should do. Two questions that I wanted to run by you. One, I've been brought up from an education perspective to think of the Magna Carta as a holier than holy document of freedom. What am I wrong? Is my education system wrong in making me think that?
Yes, you're wrong. The feudal aristocracy were beginning to manipulate the system to their private advantage. The feudal nobility was supposed to be public servants serving the king. But they were also beginning to think, hang on, we can use this privileged position to start collecting revenue from the commons of England. It took them centuries to actually pull it off, but yeah, Magna Carta was a contribution to that scheme.
Well, maybe we'll double click on that another time and dive in deep, because that feels like a half an hour to me of unpacking. But as you know, I like to finish these conversations with a kind of traditional closing question where I provide guests with a 10-year time horizon, and they have the ability to make a forecast or prediction of something that they would think will happen in 10 years or something they'd like to happen. I think we've covered what you think you'd like to happen from a policy perspective. In terms of what you think will happen, we've got a book in front of us called Boom Bust, House Prices, Banking and the Depression of 2010, which you wrote in 2005. What do you think is going to play out in the next event-wise in the next 2 to 3 years, and how that manifests itself over the next 10 years as your answer to my traditional closing question?
You
don't have to, you can give another answer if you want, but I just thought you might want to touch on what we've been talking about of late.
Well, I have a very pessimistic view of the next 10 years. We're at the beginnings of the run-up to the peak in house prices, which will peak in 2026. That's 2 years from now. The catastrophe that follows will eclipse what happened in 2008. In 2009 and 10, the banks realized they had these toxic mortgages, subprime mortgages in their vaults beneath the ground, and they were going to go belly up. They were going to go broke. But they were too big to fail, so the banks, the governments bailed them out. This time it's going to be the governments that are too big to fail. But who's going to bail out the governments? It's going to be chaos. And what measures that are being now taken, futile measures in my view, on things like the climate crisis, won't be funded. They can't be funded. They're not being funded now. We only have goals to try and achieve, not actual strategies for achieving these existential threats against our society. And over the 10 years from now, I'm afraid that we're going to enter a period of terrible chaos. If there's any hope, it's that the new generation will find this unacceptable. Yeah. And we'll start asking the awkward questions. We'll start burrowing deep into the facts. And instead of just turning to governments and saying, you've got to save us, the governments are responsible for creating the conditions that have rendered Britain a failed state, in fact. That these young people will say, we need a structural change. We're coming to take over the future.
And why do you think house prices are peaking in the next 2-3 years, or property prices?
It's because the way the system works, house prices operate on 14-year cycles. And when you add in the period of recession at the beginning and the end of the cycle, you end up with an 18-year business cycle. Well, we are rapidly approaching the end of the 14-year cycle. So that begins the turning point into deep recession, which is going to be a depression, which has to be a global depression because all economies are synchronized.
Yeah.
As I say, in my view, it won't be that the banks are too big to fail. It'll be governments that are so indebted, nobody will want to bail them out. What are we left with? Anarchy.
And all the telltale signs that you saw the last couple of cycles in terms of that melt up towards the end of that turning over, are they happening now, or do you expect them to start happening, or have they been happening for the last year or two to give you not confidence? I'm sure you don't want this to happen, but giving you confidence in your prediction. Is the data validating your thesis?
All the data validates it. The experts are saying that there will be no historic house price booms, that these are over. This was the latest story in the Daily Telegraph. No more
No more boom and bust.
No more boom and bust.
That sounds familiar.
Which they were saying in the past. That's why I wrote this book, Boom Bust. Of course, there'll be booms and busts because it's part of the structure. It's the DNA of the system, the financial DNA. And wishing it away ain't going to actually make it not happen. We're heading for the catastrophe over the next 10 years, and I just hope young people listen to people like you.
Well, I will choose that as the best moment to end this conversation. Thank you for sparing the time.
Thanks,
it's been a real joy. I think we could have kept going for ages, but for sake of people's attention spans, let's do it again. Maybe as this prediction starts playing out, and we can see what we can do about it and see what progress we've made. Thanks, Fred. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
This has been Meeting People. I've been your host, Amal Pandya. This is a podcast produced by Matt Cooper with music composed by Loverman.